The railroad man didn't knock. He never did. On the morning of March 4th, 1889, Harlan Driscoll walked straight through the front gate of the Mercer Ranch like he already owned it, because, as far as he was concerned, he did. He had 3 deputies behind him, a court seal in his breast pocket, and the kind of smile that only grows on men who have never been told no by anyone who mattered. He stopped in the middle of the yard, looked at the farmhouse, the barn, the fencing. Caleb Mercer had spent 11 years building with his own 2 hands, and he said, loudly enough for the ranch hands to hear, "Tear it down, all of it. We break ground Monday." He didn't wait for a response. He turned around and walked back to his carriage. That moment, that single sentence delivered without a flinch, would change the course of everything. If a story like this one speaks to something in you, the kind that reminds you what quiet people are capable of, we'd love to have you with us. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And while you're here, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. The letter had come on a Tuesday. Caleb Mercer remembered that detail clearly because Tuesdays were the days he paid his ranch hands and balanced what little remained in the household ledger, and for 3 years running, there had never been enough left over to feel anything but tired by the time the sun set. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and the kind of arithmetic that has no good answer when his eldest, Thomas, came in from the road with the mail. Thomas was 14, quiet by nature, and he had the habit of sorting letters by size before handing them over. A habit he'd picked up from his mother, who had been dead for 2 years, and whose habits all 4 of the Mercer children had unconsciously preserved the way. People preserve a room that no longer has anyone in it. The letter from the Matrimonial Register of Kansas City was at the bottom of the pile. Caleb set it aside twice before he opened it. He had filled out the inquiry form 6 months earlier during a particularly bad week. The week the north pasture fence collapsed in a storm. The week young May ran a fever that lasted 4 days. The week he'd stood in the yard at midnight and been unable to name a single reason why any of it was going to get better. A neighbor woman had suggested the register. "You've got 4 children and no one to help you raise them," she had said plainly. "That's not a shame, that's just arithmetic." He had sent the form more out of desperation than hope, and by the time the response arrived, he had mostly convinced himself that nothing would come of it. The letter informed him that a woman named Vivian Hale, age 31, currently residing at a boarding house in St. Louis, had expressed interest in his profile and was prepared to travel west if he wished to proceed. There was a brief description, sensible, practical, no embellishments, and a small photograph tucked into the envelope. The photograph showed a woman sitting very straight in a wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who was not accustomed to being looked at and was managing it through sheer will. Caleb looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he folded the letter, tucked it in his shirt pocket, and went back to the arithmetic. But he wrote back. He couldn't entirely explain why, except that there was something in that photograph, not beauty exactly, though she wasn't plain, but something in the set of her shoulders, the controlled stillness of her hands, that reminded him of a person carrying a great deal of weight and doing it without making a sound about it. He recognized that posture. He saw it in his own reflection some mornings. They exchanged 4 letters over the following 8 weeks. Vivian's letters were careful and honest in a way that surprised him. She didn't describe herself in flattering terms. She mentioned that she had been ill the previous winter and was still not entirely recovered. She said she had no family to speak of and no resources beyond what she could carry, and that she understood if that made her a poor candidate. She said she was not afraid of hard work, but she wanted him to know that she wasn't strong in the way some women were strong, not physically, and she didn't want to arrive under false pretenses. He had written back, "Come anyway." I wasn't sure that was wisdom. He wasn't sure it wasn't, but it was what he wrote. The arrangement was straightforward. She would come to Broken Creek, Colorado on the 15th of March. They would be married by the Justice of the Peace, and she would take on the household, the cooking, the children, the ordinary management of daily life that had been fraying at the edges since Margaret died. It wasn't romantic. Neither of them pretended it was. But it was honest, and after 2 years of trying to keep everything from falling apart by himself, Caleb had come to believe that honesty was worth more than romance anyway. He drove the wagon to the station alone. He'd considered bringing the children but decided against it. Not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't want them to crowd her before she'd had a chance to catch her breath. Children had a way of overwhelming people, even people who claimed to like them, and he'd learned to give newcomers a few hours before the full weight of the Mercer household descended. The train from St. Louis was 40 minutes late. He stood on the platform in his good coat, the one he only wore to town, and watched the other passengers disembark. A family with luggage stacked impractically high, a salesman type with a sample case. Two young men arguing about something neither of them was going to win. And then, near the end of the car, moving carefully down the steps with one hand on the rail and the other gripping a suitcase that looked nearly as worn as the dress she was wearing, Vivian Hale. She was thinner than the photograph, considerably. The dress hung on her in a way that told a story without using a single word. Her face was pale in the way that isn't natural complexion, but is instead the residue of prolonged illness, and there were shadows under her eyes that looked permanent. She stood on the platform and scanned the crowd with the measured composure of a woman who has prepared herself for the possibility that no one might be there. Caleb raised his hand. "Miss Hale?" She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Relief, he thought, though it was too controlled to be certain. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He walked over and reached for the suitcase. She let him take it, and he noticed that she released it with the faint hesitation of someone accustomed to not letting go of the things they needed. The suitcase was heavy for its size. "You have a good trip?" he asked, because it was the kind of thing people said, even when the answer was obviously no. "Long," she said. She looked at him squarely. "I want to be honest with you before we go any further. I look worse than my letters may have implied. I'm told I'll improve with consistent meals and less travel, but I don't want you to have expected something and found something else." He looked at her. She looked back. "I didn't expect much," he said. It came out blunter than he intended, and he saw her blink. "That's not... I didn't come here with a list of requirements. I came here because I have 4 children who need a settled household, and I can't be everywhere at once." "I understand," she said. "You still willing to go through with it?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. He nodded. "Then let's get the paperwork done." They were married that afternoon in the Justice of the Peace's office, with 2 witnesses pulled in off the street, a feed store clerk and an older woman who teared up without any apparent reason and who Vivian thanked sincerely on the way out. It took 11 minutes. The justice shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Vivian, and that was the ceremony. On the drive out to the ranch, they were mostly quiet. The road from Broken Creek wound through low hills and scrub brush, and the late afternoon light stretched long across the ground, in the way it did in March when the cold was starting to loosen, but hadn't let go entirely. Caleb drove, and Vivian sat beside him with the suitcase at her feet, and after a while she said, "How old are the children?" "Thomas is 14, Clara's 11, Owen's 8, May just turned 6. "Are they..." She paused. "Are they all right? With this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas is reserving judgment. Clara will probably be kind to you right away because she's been trying to be the woman of the house, and she's tired of it. Owen will ignore you for about a week before he decides you're interesting. May will climb on you immediately." He heard something that was almost a laugh from beside him. "I don't mind being climbed on." "Good," he said, "because she will." They came up the long road to the ranch as the sun was going down, and Caleb noticed, the way he always did, the moment when you could see the whole property laid out. The house, the barn, the fencing running out to the east pasture, the mountains just visible at the far edge. He'd built all of it. That was still true. Whatever else was complicated, that part was simple. What wasn't simple, what he hadn't told Vivian yet and hadn't entirely known how to, was the letter that had arrived 3 days ago from the Denver and Western Railroad Company, informing Caleb Mercer that their survey records indicated a portion of his eastern property fell within the right-of-way established by the Railroad Act, and that they would be exercising their claim beginning the following month. He'd read it 4 times. He'd shown it to his lawyer in town, a tired man named Pettiford, who handled mostly wills and minor disputes, and who had gone pale reading the document and said, "Caleb, if their surveys are right, there's not much I can do." He hadn't yet told the children. He hadn't yet told anyone except Pettiford, and now he had a wife, which meant he had one more person he would eventually need to tell. But not tonight. Tonight they were just getting to know the house. May was waiting on the porch. She had been planted there, Caleb suspected, since around noon, having decided that if she watched the road long enough, it would produce results. She was small and sharp-eyed, with her mother's red hair and her father's stubbornness. And when the wagon came into the yard, she stood up straight and watched Vivian get down with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old conducting a serious evaluation. Vivian stepped down carefully, still moving with that cautious economy of someone who wasn't entirely certain of her body's cooperation. She looked at May. May looked at her. "Your hair is the same color as Papa's horse," May announced. Vivian touched her hair self-consciously. It was brown, a kind of medium brown that wasn't notable. "Is the horse nice?" she asked. May considered this. "He bites sometimes." "May," Caleb said. "But mostly he's nice," May added quickly. Vivian's face did that almost laughing thing again. "Then I'll take that as a compliment." Clara came out next, wiping her hands on her apron, with the prematurely responsible air of a girl who had been managing other people's feelings for 2 years and was very tired of it. She said, "Welcome, Mrs. Mercer," in a tone that was formal enough to be polite and warm enough to be genuine, and Caleb felt the tightness in his chest ease by about 10%. Owen appeared in the doorway, looked at Vivian, said nothing, and went back inside. Right on schedule. Thomas didn't come out at all, which Caleb had expected. He would deal with Thomas later. He showed Vivian the house. It wasn't large, a main room, a kitchen, 3 bedrooms, but it was solid, and Margaret had made it comfortable in ways that had outlasted her. Caleb watched Vivian move through the rooms carefully, not touching things unnecessarily, not making assessments out loud, taking in what she saw with the same measured attention she'd shown at the train station. She asked one practical question: where was the water pump? He showed her. He'd given her Margaret's room, which had been empty since the funeral. He'd spent a week debating whether that was wrong, and had ultimately decided it was the only room with a proper window and adequate space, and that making practical decisions was not the same as forgetting someone. He set her suitcase inside the door. She looked at the room. "It's good," she said simply. It wasn't a performance of gratitude. It wasn't forced cheerfulness. It was the plain statement of someone who had been sleeping somewhere not good for a long time and recognized the difference. He left her to settle in and went to find Thomas. His eldest was in the barn, doing unnecessary work on a harness that didn't need attention. Caleb recognized the move. He'd used it himself a dozen times, the physical task as an excuse to avoid the conversation. He sat down on a hay bale and waited. Thomas kept working. After a while, he said, without looking up, "Is she staying?" "She's my wife," Caleb said. "So yes." Thomas turned the harness over in his hands. He was a serious-looking boy, angular in the way teenagers get before they fill out, with the kind of old eyes that come from watching a parent grieve. "Mama's only been gone 2 years." "I know that. It feels fast." Caleb looked at his son carefully. "You're right," he said. "It is fast. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But Thomas, I need help. And you children need more than I can give you by myself." He paused. "She's not replacing your mother. That's not what this is." Thomas set the harness down. He still didn't look at Caleb directly, but his jaw unclenched slightly, which was the closest thing to agreement the boy had at 14. "What's she like?" Thomas asked. Caleb thought about it. "Honest," he said. "She told me everything that was wrong with her before she'd been off the train 5 minutes. Most people don't do that." Thomas didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking," Caleb said. He went back to the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see May sitting at the table, talking at Vivian with her usual volume and speed, and Vivian was listening, really listening. Not the half-distracted listening of an adult humoring a child, but the genuine focused attention of someone who found what was being said interesting. May was explaining something about a rabbit. The explanation involved a lot of hand gestures. Caleb stood outside in the cold for a moment and watched. Then he went inside. The next 3 days were cautious. Not bad, cautious. There's a difference, though from the outside they can look similar. Vivian moved through the house with the deliberate care of someone learning a new language. She watched how things were done before she suggested changes. She asked Clara's opinion on the meal schedule and took the answer seriously, which Clara hadn't expected and which visibly affected her in ways she was trying not to show. She found Owen's weakness, which was a genuine and unguarded curiosity about maps and diagrams, within 48 hours, and by the second evening had drawn him a rough sketch of the Missouri River Basin from memory that produced the first sustained conversation the boy had been willing to have with anyone outside the family in months. Thomas watched all of this from a careful distance. Caleb watched too, though less obviously. She wasn't pretending. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She wasn't performing the role of pleasant new wife for the children's benefit. She was genuinely curious about them, genuinely attentive, and when something was difficult, when May had a tantrum about a lost toy, when Clara burned dinner and stood over the stove in rigid, embarrassed silence, Vivian didn't smooth it over with false cheerfulness. She sat with the difficulty. She helped without taking over. He hadn't expected that. On the fourth morning, he came downstairs earlier than usual and found her already at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, studying the papers spread across the far end of the table. The ranch ledgers, the property maps, and pushed slightly to one side, the letter from the Denver and Western Railroad Company. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. There was no guilt in her expression. She hadn't been snooping. The papers had been there. But there was something alert in her face, something sharpened. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. I came down early and these were—" "It's all right," he said. He came in and poured his coffee. "I was going to tell you. The railroad is claiming part of your eastern pasture." "According to their survey, yes." She looked back then at the property map. Her finger traced the line marked in red by the railroad company's documents. "How far east does your deed read?" He sat down across from her and told her. She asked two more questions, specific questions, technical questions, the kind he hadn't expected a woman to ask, though he recognized immediately afterward that the expectation said more about him than about her. She was quiet for a moment after. Then she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you not to be offended by it." "Go ahead." "When were these maps drawn?" "The originals?" "When my father filed the deed, 1863. "And the railroad's claim? When was that survey conducted?" "They say 68. She looked at the map for another long moment. 5 years, she said quietly, almost to herself. Then she looked at him directly. "How good is your lawyer?" He told her about Pettiford. She nodded slowly. "And he said there's not much he can do, if their surveys are right." She looked back at the documents. There was something in her expression that he couldn't read exactly. Not quite alarm, not quite recognition, something in between. Something that looked like a person who has just heard a familiar sound from a direction they didn't expect. "I'd like to look at these more carefully," she said. "If you don't mind." "Be my guest," he said. She nodded and went back to the papers, and Caleb drank his coffee and watched her read, and had the first faint sense that this quiet, thin woman in his kitchen might be something quite different from what she appeared. He would have that feeling many more times before it was over. The town of Broken Creek did not receive Vivian Mercer warmly. This surprised no one who understood small towns, which is to say, it surprised no one in Broken Creek. The merchant district ran 3 blocks along the main road, and within those 3 blocks, the social intelligence was comprehensive. Everyone knew about the mail order arrangement. Everyone had a theory about why a man would need to go that far to find a wife. Most of those theories were not flattering, either to Caleb or to the woman he'd brought home. When Vivian came into town for the first time, 4 days after the wedding, accompanying Caleb to the dry goods store, she was evaluated from 7 different angles before she reached the door. The most direct evaluation came from Helen Gruber, who ran the millinery with the efficiency of a general and the judgment of a hanging judge, and who stopped Vivian on the wooden sidewalk with a social grace that was technically unimpeachable. "You must be the new Mrs. Mercer," she said, in the tone of someone identifying a mildly suspicious object. "We were all wondering about you." "Were you?" Vivian said. It wasn't quite a question. "Caleb's a well-regarded man in this town. Very well regarded. People here feel," Helen chose the word carefully, "protective of him." Vivian looked at her steadily. "I imagine they do," she said. "It seems like the kind of town that looks after its own." "We do," Helen said. "I'm his wife," Vivian said pleasantly. "I'm one of his own now." She smiled and went into the dry goods store, and Helen Gruber watched her go with the expression of someone who has just made an argument that went sideways. Inside the store, while Caleb talked to the proprietor, Vivian moved along the shelves with quiet efficiency, and Caleb overheard two women near the back who thought they were speaking quietly. "Doesn't look like much, does she?" And, well, what did he expect going through a catalog? He'd started to turn around. Vivian put a hand on his arm briefly. She shook her head once, very slightly. "Don't." He turned back to the counter. "Let them," she said quietly when they were outside again. "They don't know anything about you." "They know exactly enough," she said. "I arrived poor, sick, and without family on a catalog arrangement. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to have an opinion about. I'd rather prove myself than argue about it." He looked at her sideways. "You're not angry?" "I'm always a little angry," she said. "I've learned to put it somewhere useful." He didn't know what to say to that. He filed it away in the category of things about this woman that he hadn't anticipated. They were walking back to the wagon when Gerald Foss stepped out of the land office. Gerald Foss was, technically, the county land agent, which in theory meant he served the landowners of the county, and in practice meant he served the railroad company, which paid better and asked fewer difficult questions. He was a square-built man in his late 40s with the manner of someone who had spent so long being indirectly dishonest that he'd forgotten any other way to talk. "Mercer," he said. His eyes went to Vivian with polite neutrality and then away. "Heard you got my letter." "The railroad's letter," Caleb said. "Railroad copied me on it, as the county agent. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. The surveyor's measurements are solid. I've looked them over personally. Their claim on the eastern right-of-way is legally airtight. My deed says otherwise. Your deed was drawn before the railroad's right-of-way was established by federal act," Foss said patiently, in the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. "The act supersedes the deed. That's the law." "I'll be consulting with my lawyer further," Caleb said. "Of course," Foss said pleasantly. He glanced at Vivian again. "Congratulations on your marriage, by the way." It didn't sound like a congratulation. It sounded like a notation. He went back inside. Caleb was quiet walking to the wagon. Vivian said nothing until they were up on the seat and heading out of town, and then she said, "That man." "Foss? He said the railroad's measurements are solid and that he'd looked them over personally." "Right. The county land agent doesn't look over railroad surveys personally. That's not in his jurisdiction." She was looking at the road ahead of them, and her voice was careful, measured, like someone building something out loud. He would only say that if someone had told him to. Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" She turned to meet his eyes. For a moment he thought she was going to tell him something. Instead, she seemed to make a decision, an internal one, and she said, "I mean, I'd like to look at those maps more carefully when we get home. All of them. Everything you have." "All right," he said slowly. "And Caleb," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. in front of it, he realized. "I need to tell you something about myself. Something I probably should have said sooner." He kept his eyes on the road. "Tell me now." She was quiet for a moment. "Before things went wrong," she said. "Before my husband died and the money was gone and I ended up at a boarding house in St. Louis with one bag and a choice between this and nothing, I had a profession. It wasn't a common one for a woman. But I had it." She paused. "I worked for the Missouri Pacific Railroad as a surveyor's assistant for 6 years. I can read survey maps the way you read a ledger. I can look at a set of measurements and tell you immediately if something has been altered." The wagon moved through the morning air. Caleb didn't speak for a moment. "Why didn't you put that in your letters?" he asked. "Because I didn't know it was relevant," she said. "And because—" She stopped. "Because I've learned that announcing you know more than people expect tends to make them uncomfortable before they know what to do with it." He thought about Gerald Foss. The patient explanation. Their claim is legally airtight. "You think the maps are wrong," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that I want to look at them. And I think that if my instinct is right, then what's happening to your ranch isn't a legal dispute, it's a theft." She looked at him directly. "And I need you to understand, well, if that's what it is, I can't unknow what I know. Once I look at those documents, whatever I find, I'm going to have to say so." He looked at her. This thin, pale, quiet woman who had arrived at his train station with one suitcase and an apology. "Look at the maps," he said. She spread everything across the kitchen table that evening after the children were in bed. Caleb's original deed and property description. the county survey records from 1863, the railroad survey filing from 1868, the letter from the Denver and Western with its attached measurements and signatures, the county land agent's own records, which Caleb had pulled from a box he'd nearly forgotten about, filed during his father's time. Vivian worked quietly and methodically. She had a pencil in her hand and a piece of fresh paper beside her where she was writing figures, and she moved between documents with the efficient focus of someone who had done this for 6 years and whose hands still remembered the work. Caleb sat at the other end of the table and watched, and didn't interrupt. An hour passed, maybe more. The fire in the kitchen stove settled into a steady low sound. Outside, the wind moved through the empty pasture. Then Vivian set her pencil down. Caleb looked up. "There," she said. She turned one of the railroad survey documents toward him and placed her finger on a specific coordinate entry. "And here," a second document. The bearing marker for the eastern boundary in the railroad's 1868 survey is 4 degrees different from every other survey in this region from the same period, including 3 other railroad surveys I can see referenced in these records. She looked at him. 4 degrees. That's not a surveyor's error. That's too deliberate to be an error. Caleb looked at the numbers. They meant less to him than to her, but the steadiness in her voice meant something. What does 4 degrees mean in terms of actual land? On a section this size? She did a quick calculation on her paper. At the distance of your eastern boundary from the benchmark, it shifts the line approximately 340 feet to the west. He stared at her. 340 feet, which would capture, she looked at the property map, your water access at the creek bend and the flat ground on the eastern slope. She looked up. Do you know what the railroad plans to do with that land? He knew. The railroad agent had said it in town just that week to anyone who would listen. They were building a maintenance depot. They needed flat land and water access. They had apparently found both on the edge of Caleb Mercer's property. They adjusted the survey, he said. It wasn't a question. The numbers say so, Vivian said, but numbers aren't proof enough on their own. The railroad will produce the original survey marker. Their marker will be in the wrong place, in the place that supports their measurement. To prove it's wrong, you need the actual original marker, the one from 63. Or earlier, if your father's deed references a pre-existing marker. She looked at him steadily. Those markers don't disappear. Stone doesn't move. But they get buried, overgrown, overlooked, especially when it's convenient for certain people to overlook them. Caleb sat back in his chair. 340 feet, the water, the flat land, and a man in the county land office who had taken a personal interest in telling him the railroad's claim was airtight. If I find the original marker, he said, and it proves the survey is falsified, what then? Then you have evidence, Vivian said. Real evidence. Not a counterargument, not a lawyer's letter, not a petition. Actual documented physical proof that their survey is fraudulent. She paused, which is a different thing entirely. He looked at her. She looked back, and there was something in her expression that was neither hope nor certainty, but was closer to the kind of quiet determination that doesn't need either. Where would it be? He asked. She looked at the original deed. She looked at the early county survey records. She looked at the property map for a long time. Here, she said, and put her finger on a point in the wilderness at the eastern edge of the Mercer property. A rocky slope above the creek, covered in brush and decades of overgrowth, where no one had had reason to go in years. I know that area, Caleb said. Then, Vivian said quietly, we're going to have to go there. He looked at her. This woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks, who had arrived at his station thin and pale and apologetic, who had just spent 2 hours dismantling a railroad company's legal case with a pencil and a 20-year-old county record. You realize, he said, that if you're right, these aren't just lawyers we're dealing with. These are people who falsified federal documents, people with money, people with deputies, she said quietly. Yes, I know. She folded her hands on the table. They weren't quite steady. He noticed that, the faint tremor, the residue of whatever it was that had made her ill, whatever it was that had taken everything she'd had and left her with one suitcase and an advertisement in a matrimonial register. But her voice was steady. I've spent 3 years having nothing, she said. Nothing to offer anyone, nothing to protect, nothing to lose except my own survival. And I spent those 3 years being very, very careful. She met his eyes. But this is your ranch, Caleb. This is your children's land. And I know things that matter here, and I would rather be afraid and useful than safe and silent. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then we go Thursday, he said. Before the frost breaks and the ground gets soft. Before the railroad sends anyone else out to walk that eastern boundary. Vivian nodded. Outside, the wind had gone still. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. And somewhere east of the ranch, buried under 26 years of brush and indifference, a stone marker waited in the dark. The only thing standing between a fraudulent railroad claim and everything the Mercer family had ever built. They didn't know yet what it would cost them to find it. They would. Thursday came the way hard days usually do. Not with any particular warning, just a gray light at the window and the sound of the wind already moving through the dry grass before anyone in the house was fully awake. Vivian was up first. She'd been awake since before 4, lying in the dark with the survey figures running through her head, the way numbers sometimes did when the mind refused to let them rest. She had gone over the documents 3 more times the previous 2 days, each time arriving at the same conclusion, each time wishing she were wrong. The 4-degree discrepancy didn't waver. It didn't soften under repeated examination. It sat in the numbers like a stone, fixed, deliberate, and ugly. She dressed in the warmest clothes she owned, which weren't warm enough, and went downstairs. Clara was already in the kitchen. This didn't surprise Vivian anymore. Clara Mercer ran on the internal schedule of a woman twice her age, and her version of sleeping in was being downstairs only slightly before everyone else. She was making coffee without being asked, moving around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a girl who had learned to be useful before she was old enough to want to be anything else. "You're going out east today," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Vivian said. "Papa told us last night, after supper." Clara poured a mug and set it on the table without looking at her directly. "He didn't say why exactly." "There's a property matter that needs looking into." Clara turned around. She was 11, but the eyes were older, and the calculation in them was entirely genuine. "Is the railroad really going to take part of the ranch?" Vivian looked at her steadily. "We're trying to make sure they can't." Clara nodded once. It wasn't the nod of a reassured child. It was the nod of someone absorbing information and deciding how to carry it. Then she went back to the stove. Caleb came down 20 minutes later, dressed for hard walking, heavy boots, his oldest coat, the one with the collar he could turn up against wind. He ate what Clara put in front of him without comment. Vivian ate too, more than she usually managed in the morning, because she understood it was going to be a long day, and her body's preferences weren't the relevant factor. Owen appeared in the doorway at some point, looked at the two of them in their outdoor coats, and said, "Are you going to find the marker?" Both Caleb and Vivian looked at him. "I was listening," he said, without apology. He was 8 and had his father's directness without yet having learned the social cushioning that adults wrap around it. The stone marker from grandfather's time, the one that shows where the land really ends. Caleb looked at Vivian. She looked back. "Yes," Caleb said. Owen nodded slowly. "I know where there's an old stone pile on the east slope. I found it 2 summers ago. I thought it was just rocks." The kitchen went quiet. Caleb set down his fork. "Show me on the map." Owen patted over in his socks and looked at the property map on the table. He put his finger on a spot, a specific spot, not a general area, but a particular point on the slope above the creek bend, and his finger landed within a 1/4 inch of where Vivian had placed hers 2 nights ago. Vivian felt the back of her neck go cold. "That's it," she said quietly. Owen looked up at her. "Is that important?" "Very," she said. The boy seemed to absorb this with the same composed practicality as his sister. "I can draw you how to get there, the direct way from the east pasture gate." "Do that," Caleb said. Owen went and got his school paper and a pencil, and he drew a map. A careful, detailed, surprisingly accurate map for an 8-year-old, with landmarks noted. A split juniper, a dry creek channel that ran northwest, a particular shelf of exposed rock that jutted out above the slope like the brim of a hat. Vivian watched him draw it and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't entirely name. This family, these children who had been left to manage too much for too long, who had developed in response to that difficulty a set of careful, practical intelligences that most adults she'd known would have envied. She folded the map and put it in her coat pocket alongside her original field notes. Those notes were the other things she hadn't entirely told Caleb yet. She had told him she'd worked as a surveyor's assistant. She had told him she could read the maps. What she hadn't told him, what she had been carrying in the bottom of that worn suitcase since St. Louis, tucked beneath her one spare dress and the small case of her mother's letters, was that she still had her original field notebooks from the Missouri Pacific Survey work. 6 years of handwritten notes, measurements, bearings, benchmark references, field observations recorded in her own hand in the precise shorthand the head surveyor had taught her. She had brought them without entirely knowing why. The habit of a person who has learned not to throw things away that might matter. She had taken them out 3 nights ago and gone through them until 2 in the morning, cross-referencing the notation system she'd used against the Denver and Western's filed documents. The notation systems were different railroad, different period, but the benchmarks overlapped. The regional trigonometric stations used as reference points in both surveys were the same fixed federal markers. And when she mapped the Denver and Western's claimed boundary line against the benchmark coordinates she had recorded with her own hands in 1877, the 4-degree discrepancy wasn't ambiguous. It was proof, or close enough to it that a judge who was willing to listen would have to take it seriously. The notebooks were in her coat pocket, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. She hadn't told Caleb about them yet because she was still deciding what telling him would mean. If she put those notebooks on a courtroom table, she would be establishing, publicly, who she was, what she knew, where she had been. And there were people in her past connected to that railroad work whose awareness of her current whereabouts she was not eager to invite. But that was a problem for after they found the marker, one thing at a time. They left the ranch as the sun came over the hills and turned the frost on the grass to brief silver. Caleb carried a short shovel, a length of rope, and his rifle, which he brought the way practical men bring rifles in open country, not expecting to use it, unwilling to need it and not have it. Vivian carried the oilcloth-wrapped notebooks, Owen's map, and the survey documents folded into her inside coat pocket, close against her body where the wind couldn't reach them. The walk east took the better part of an hour. The terrain roughened as they moved away from the cultivated pasture land, scrub brush thickening, the ground rising into the low rocky slopes that formed the natural eastern boundary of the Mercer property before the creek cut north. Caleb knew this land the way people know land they've worked for years, not with maps in their head but with the body, with the feet recognizing grades and the eyes reading vegetation. He set the pace and Vivian kept it, which cost her more than she let show. The cold was in her lungs in a way that wasn't comfortable, and the slope worked muscles that hadn't been worked like this in a long time. She didn't say anything about it. She kept moving. "You all right?" Caleb asked once, when she paused at a rise to catch her breath. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with the measuring look she'd noticed he used when he suspected someone of being less than honest about their condition. Then he slowed his pace by about 15% for the rest of the climb, which was enough to help and done without comment, which was the right way to do it. They found the split juniper from Owen's map. They followed the dry creek channel northwest until the shelf of exposed rock appeared above them. And just below it, on the slope, half buried in 2 decades of accumulated dead brush and hard soil, a pile of stones. Not just a pile. When Caleb pulled away the brush with his hands and Vivian crouched to look, they could see the shape of it. Not random stones stacked by erosion or a wandering ranch hand, but a deliberate configuration, 3 large flat stones laid in a pattern with a vertical marker stone at the center. Federal survey stations from the 1860s were marked exactly this way. She had seen dozens of them. "That's it," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Caleb looked at her. "You're sure?" The configuration, the marker stone in the center, scraped that top stone. She handed him the folded survey sheet. "There should be markings. A date, a bearing notation, a surveyor's signature or initials." He took the small shovel and worked carefully around the central stone, clearing the compacted soil from its face. It took a while. The stone had settled deep. But when the face of it came clear, first just a line, then more, carved directly into the granite face and the careful measured chisels of a professional surveyor, Vivian read it and felt her hands go still. The date, August 14th, came pin 63, a bearing notation in standard federal format, and below it, a name, R.C. Hollis, U.S. Deputy Surveyor. Hollis, she said. You know that name? I know of him. He was one of the most respected federal surveyors in the territory in the 60s. His work was used as reference by 3 different railroad surveys I saw during my time with the Missouri Pacific. She looked at Caleb. If Hollis planted this marker, it is not going to be easy to argue it's in the wrong place. Caleb looked at the stone. Then he pulled the railroad survey document from her hand and found the claimed boundary line. He looked at the marker. He looked at the document. He didn't need a surveyor's training to see the gap. They're claiming the boundary is 300 feet west of this stone, he said. 340. He stood up. He wasn't a man who showed anger the way some men did. Loud, visible, instant. He showed it the way contained men show it. A stillness in the jaw, a flatness in the eyes, a very controlled quality to the breathing. She watched it move through him. Someone moved a line on a paper, he said, to take my water and my flatland. Yes. And Foss knew. I think Foss did more than know, Vivian said carefully. The county land agent's records are what the railroad surveyors reference for regional benchmarks. If Foss gave them doctored regional data, she paused. This didn't happen by accident. Someone made a decision. Someone paid for it. Caleb looked at her. How do we prove it? She had been thinking about this for 2 days. We document this marker. You measure from it to 3 fixed reference points in the county records, measurements anyone can verify independently. We photograph it if we can get a photographer out here, or we bring a witness, someone whose testimony carries weight. She looked back at the stone. She stopped. What? Caleb said. She made the decision, the one she'd been putting off. She reached into her coat and took out the oilcloth-wrapped package. She held it for a moment, and then she unwrapped it and held the notebooks out to him. He looked at them, then at her. I told you I worked as a surveyor's assistant, she said. These are my field notebooks. 6 years of survey work with the Missouri Pacific Railroad. Regional benchmark coordinates, recorded in my hand, independently verifiable. She kept her voice flat and steady. The same benchmark network the Denver and Western used to establish their claim. If I cross-reference these notebooks against the Denver and Western's filed measurements, the discrepancy doesn't require interpretation. It's arithmetic. He was looking at the notebooks in her hand. You had these the whole time? Yes. And why didn't you tell me sooner? She looked at him directly. Because once these notebooks exist in this dispute, I exist in this dispute, publicly, with my history, my credentials, my name attached. And there are people connected to my previous railroad work whose attention I've been avoiding for 2 years. She paused. I needed to be sure first. I needed to know that the evidence was real enough to be worth it. He was quiet. Is it? He asked. Yes, she said. It's real enough. He took the notebooks from her hands and looked at them for a moment. These worn, water-stained field notebooks that a woman had carried across 3 states in a suitcase with nothing else. Then he handed them back. You don't have to, he said. I want you to understand that. This is my land. It's not yours to sacrifice yourself over. She looked at him, this man she had married 2 weeks ago, who had driven to a train station to collect a woman he'd never met, and hadn't flinched when she was not what he might have hoped for. It is my land, she said. I'm your wife. He held her gaze. Then he nodded, just once. They spent the next hour documenting the marker. Caleb measured distance to 3 reference points, a distinctive rock formation to the north, the creek bend to the east, the property fence post to the west, while Vivian recorded every measurement in precise notation, dating and signing each entry. She noted the marker's configuration, the surveyor's markings, the depth of settlement in the ground, the vegetation growth pattern around the stones that indicated decades of undisturbed placement. She worked with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what documentation needs to contain and exactly why. When they were done, she looked at what they had. It wasn't a courtroom victory yet. It was evidence. Evidence required a judge willing to hear it, a lawyer capable of presenting it, and a community that was willing to believe a mail-order bride over a railroad company. None of those things were guaranteed, but it was real. Documented, measured, witnessed, and real. She wrapped the notebooks back in the oilcloth. Caleb covered the marker with brush again, loose enough to find quickly, concealed enough that a railroad survey team walking the area wouldn't immediately spot it. They started back down the slope. They were halfway across the east pasture when Caleb stopped walking. Vivian stopped beside him and followed his gaze. There was a buggy on the road outside the ranch gate. A good buggy, not a working man's rig. And standing beside it, talking to Thomas at the gate, was Gerald Foss. Caleb's jaw went to that still, flat quality again. "What does he want?" Vivian said quietly. "He's checking," Caleb said. "That's what men like Foss do when they're nervous. They come around to check." "What could have made him nervous?" Caleb looked at her. "You. He saw you in town looking at those survey documents. A woman who knows what she's looking at is a different problem than a rancher with a lawyer." She felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to it. "He doesn't know about the notebooks," she said. "No," Caleb said. "He doesn't know about the notebooks yet." They walked toward the gate. Thomas, who had apparently been raised to handle situations with more composure than his years warranted, was maintaining a politely non-committal conversation with Foss that gave nothing away and committed to nothing. He spotted his father and stepmother coming across the pasture, and his expression didn't change, but he straightened slightly. Foss turned. "Mercer," he said. His eyes went to Vivian with a different kind of attention than before. "Mrs. Mercer, quite a morning for a walk." "Is it?" Caleb said. "I came to let you know personally. The railroad has filed the formal claim papers with the county court. The proceeding is scheduled for the 12th. He said it pleasantly, in the manner of a man delivering information he already knows you don't want to receive. "I understand you're planning to contest the claim. That's your right, of course. But I want to be straightforward with you, as a neighbor. Their documentation is thorough. I've reviewed it personally. The judge in this county is a reasonable man, but he is also a man who respects complete legal filings." He paused. Vivian understood the pause. It was the pause before the part that sounded like advice but functioned as a threat. "If you have any plans to bring non-standard evidence into this proceeding," Foss continued, "I think carefully about how that looks to the court. An unsupported counterclaim can sometimes make things worse, not better." He was looking at her when he said it. Not at Caleb. At her. She held his gaze and said nothing. Caleb said, "Thank you for the information about the schedule, Foss." Foss recognized the dismissal. He tipped his hat, at Caleb, not at her, and got back in his buggy and drove away. Thomas watched the buggy go. Then he looked at his father. "He was asking questions before you came back, about what work you'd been doing out east, whether anyone had been out to the creek boundary lately." "What did you tell him?" Caleb said. "That I wasn't sure what work you were doing," which was true. Thomas looked at Vivian with a directness that reminded her uncomfortably of Owen. "Did you find what you needed?" She met the 14-year-old's eyes. "Yes," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. That was all. He went back inside. Vivian and Caleb stood in the yard for a moment. "He knows we're looking," Caleb said. "He suspects," she said. "He doesn't know what we found, and he definitely doesn't know about the notebooks. How long before he tries to find out?" She thought about the timing. The proceeding was the 12th. Today was the 4th. 8 days. "We need a lawyer," she said. "Not Pettiford." Caleb looked at her. "Pettiford is the only lawyer in Broken Creek." "Then we need one from somewhere else. Someone who handles federal survey disputes, not wills and minor land contracts." She turned to face him fully. "And we need someone who can corroborate my credentials, who can confirm that my notebooks are legitimate, not documents I fabricated to support my husband's case." She paused. "Because that's what Foss will argue. He'll say I manufactured the discrepancy. He'll make it about me being a woman with a suspicious past and a convenient skill set who arrived just in time to produce convenient evidence." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Is there someone who can corroborate?" She'd been thinking about this on the walk back. There was a man named Walter Drummond who had been the chief surveyor for the Missouri Pacific during her time there. He'd retired to Denver 2 years ago. She had a letter from him in her possession, a professional reference he'd written when she'd still hoped she might find surveying work after her husband's death, in which he described her abilities in language that was, by Drummond's reserved standards, almost effusive. She hadn't used it because the life she'd been hoping to build had collapsed before the letter had any opportunity to be relevant. "There's someone," she said, "in Denver. Can you reach him in time?" "I can write to him today. Whether he responds in time." She shook her head. "I don't know." Caleb looked at the road where Foss's buggy had disappeared. Then he looked back at her. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while May drew pictures beside her and Clara made dinner behind them, and the ordinary sounds of the house moved around her. She wrote it in her best hand, which was still good despite everything, and she was precise about what she was asking. Not testimony, not necessarily a personal appearance, but a signed statement confirming her employment, her competence, and the integrity of the notation system she had used in her field notebooks. She sealed it and gave it to Caleb, who drove into town the next morning and paid the extra freight rate for rapid postal delivery to Denver. Then they waited. Waiting, Vivian had learned, was the part that cost people most. It was the space where doubt lived. In the 3 days following, she went through the notebooks twice more, cross-referencing every entry that touched the relevant benchmark network, making sure her documentation was airtight, making sure there was no gap that a railroad company's lawyer could insert a blade into. She also spent time with the children. Not as distraction, she wasn't the kind of person who used people as distraction, but because they were there and she was genuinely interested in them. And because whatever happened on the 12th, this was still her house, and these were still her husband's children, and she wanted them to know her as a person before they knew her as a woman involved in a legal dispute. Owen showed her the rest of his maps collection. He had been drawing maps since he was 6, his father said, of everything from the pasture to the route to school to what he imagined the territories further west looked like based on descriptions he'd read. They were remarkably good. She spent an hour showing him the proper notation systems for elevation and water flow, and he absorbed it with the focused greed of a child who has found the precise thing his mind was built for. Thomas came to her on the 5th day. Not loudly, he just appeared in the kitchen doorway in the morning, holding his hat, and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. He came in and sat down at the table across from her. He was quiet for a moment, working up to it the way teenagers work up to things they've decided matter. "Do you actually think we can win this?" he said. "Against the railroad. I know what you found out east, Papa told me, but the railroad has lawyers and money and people." He paused. "I just want to know what you actually think, not what you're saying to make people feel better." She looked at him carefully. "I think we have a stronger case than anyone expected us to have," she said. "I think the evidence is real. I think the law supports us if someone is willing to hear it correctly." She paused. "I don't know if we'll win. I can't promise you that. What I can tell you is that I'm not lying to you or your father about what I've found." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was different from the earlier nods. Less reservation in it, more weight. "Okay," he said. He left. On the 7th day, the reply came from Denver. Caleb brought it back from town in his coat pocket and set it on the table without opening it, because Vivian was the one who had written the letter, and the reply was hers to open first. She recognized this as a form of respect, and it registered, the way small gestures of respect register with people who haven't always received them. She opened it. Walter Drummond's handwriting was exactly as she remembered it, small, precise, unhurried. He confirmed everything she'd asked. He went further. He offered to appear in person if the legal proceeding required it, and he stated, in the careful language of a man who chose his words like a surveyor chose his measurements, that in his 30-year professional career he had never encountered a field assistant with a more reliable eye for discrepancy or a more rigorous personal documentation standard than Vivian Hale. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and sat with it for a moment. Caleb was watching her. "He'll come," she said. She heard Caleb exhale. Just once, just briefly, the exhale of a man who has been holding something tight for several days. "Then we have a case," he said. "We have a case," she said. Outside, the wind was picking up from the west. The fire in the stove was going. May was somewhere in the back of the house, arguing with Owen about something that didn't matter. Clara was moving between rooms with her quiet, capable efficiency. And in 5 days, they would stand in front of a judge with evidence that a railroad company had falsified federal survey records to steal 340 feet of the Mercer family's land. What Vivian didn't know yet, what she would not learn until the morning of the 11th, the day before the proceeding, was that Gerald Foss had not been idle during those 8 days, and that the man she'd been avoiding for 2 years, the man she had not named when she'd said there were people from her past whose attention she didn't want to invite, that man had received a letter of his own, not from her, about her. The day before the hearing, a rider came to the Mercer gate just after dark. He didn't come to the door. He left a folded note tied to the gatepost and was gone before anyone in the house heard him. Caleb found it when he went out to check the gate latch. He brought it in and unfolded it at the kitchen table under the lamp. He read it. Then he set it down without speaking. Vivian picked it up. The note was unsigned. It said, "The woman you married is not who she claims to be. Her notebooks are stolen. Her credentials are false. The proceeding tomorrow will expose her for what she is. Walk away from this now and the railroad will file no charges against your household." She set the note down on the table. Her hands, she noticed, were completely steady. She looked up at Caleb. He was watching her. "Well," he said. His voice was even. "They're scared." "Yes," she said. "That means what you have is working." She looked at him. This man who had taken a stranger off a train platform on the strength of 4 letters and driven her home in a cold wagon, who had handed her field notebooks back to her and said, "It's your land," and meant it. "It also means tomorrow is going to be harder than we planned," she said. "Probably," he said. He picked up the note and fed it to the fire in the stove. Outside, the wind was cold and steady, blowing down from the mountains, and inside the kitchen, the lamp burned clear and even. Tomorrow was the 12th. They left the ranch at first light. Caleb had decided the night before that they would drive into Broken Creek early enough to speak with Pettiford before the proceeding began, early enough to give themselves whatever small margin of preparation the morning allowed. He hadn't slept much. Vivian could tell by the way he moved in the kitchen before dawn, the slightly mechanical quality of it, the way tired men perform their routines from memory when the mind is already somewhere else. She hadn't slept much either, but she'd used the hours. By 2 in the morning, she had organized the documentation into a sequence that a judge could follow without any prior knowledge of survey methodology. She had written a clear 1-page summary of the discrepancy, not technical language, plain language, and clipped it to the front of the stack. She had written out, in a separate column, the specific entries from her own field notebooks that corresponded to each point of contention, with the page numbers marked in the margin so they could be found quickly under pressure. She was not going to walk into that courtroom unprepared because someone had left a threatening note at her gate. The threatening note actually had helped. Anger, she had long ago discovered, was useful fuel when you pointed it at the right engine. The note told her they were scared. Scared men make moves, and moves leave tracks, and tracks are evidence of a different kind. The children were awake when Caleb and Vivian came downstairs with their coats on. All 4 of them, even May, who was standing in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, with the look of a child who has woken up early on instinct and is not entirely sure yet whether to be frightened. Clara had made oatmeal. She set it on the table and didn't say anything about whether she expected them to eat it before leaving, but the expectation was there in the way she set the spoons down. They ate. Thomas stood at the window the whole time, looking out at the road. He hadn't said anything since the previous evening. Vivian had noticed that this was how he processed difficulty, not by talking it through, but by going inward, by getting very still, by watching the external world with a kind of careful attention that looked like passivity, but was actually its opposite. Owen came and stood beside her while she finished her coffee. "Is Mr. Drummond going to be there?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "His letter said he would try." "What if he doesn't make it in time?" "Then we work with what we have." He considered this. "What do you have if he doesn't come?" She looked at him. 8 years old, with his father's direct eyes and a mind like a well-maintained instrument. "I have my notebooks. I have the marker documentation. I have the mathematical discrepancy laid out so clearly that someone would have to work very hard to misunderstand it." She paused. "And I have the truth on my side, which is not nothing." Owen looked at her with a seriousness that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face, and did anyway. "But sometimes truth isn't enough," he said. "Papa said that about Mama's doctor. He said the doctor made a mistake and told the truth about it, and it still didn't fix what happened." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. You're right, Vivian said. Sometimes truth isn't enough, but it's always the place to start. He seemed to accept this. May had been listening from the doorway and chose this moment to come forward and attach herself to Vivian's arm without explanation, which was apparently the 6-year-old's version of providing moral support. Caleb looked at all of them, and the look on his face was not something Vivian could entirely describe. It was the look of a man who has been responsible for people for a long time and is feeling the weight of that responsibility in a particular acute way, and is also, underneath that, proud of them, and cannot quite let himself say so because the day is too uncertain. "All right," he said, "we'll be back before supper." He said it as a statement, not a promise. She noticed the distinction. They drove the road into Broken Creek in the early cold, and Vivian held the document packet on her lap with both hands, and neither of them talked very much, which was fine. There are silences between people who have chosen to trust each other that don't need filling. Pettiford's office was above the hardware store. They climbed the outside stairs and found him already at his desk, which told her he'd been notified of the preceding time and had also not slept particularly well. He was a thin man in his 60s with a face that had been processing worry for most of his career, and when they came in, he looked at Vivian with the particular expression of a man reassessing a previous conclusion. She set the document packet on his desk. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "What is this?" "Our case," she said. He opened the packet and began to read. The color in his face went through several changes over the following 10 minutes. From the careful neutral of a professional receiving information, to something sharper, to something that looked almost like alarm, and finally to a quality Vivian recognized as the expression of a man who is realizing he has underestimated a situation and is urgently recalculating. "These field notebooks," he said slowly. "Mine," she said. 6 years of survey work with the Missouri Pacific. The benchmark coordinates I recorded independently confirmed the discrepancy. And this letter from Drummond." "Yes." "Walter Drummond." He said the name like he was verifying that it was real. "You actually have Walter Drummond prepared to testify." "He said he would try to be here. If he isn't, his signed letter is admissible as a professional statement." Pettiford sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, which Vivian interpreted as a man revising his understanding of what he was walking into. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "when you first arrived in this town, I'll be honest with you, I thought Caleb had made a situation for himself." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong." "You can be wrong and still be useful," she said. "What I need from you is someone who knows how this judge operates, what he responds to, how to pace the presentation." Pettiford nodded slowly. He was coming back online, she could see it, the professional machinery re-engaging now that he understood the terrain had changed. Judge Aldrich is a precise man. He doesn't like theatrics. He likes documentation presented cleanly and arguments made in sequence. He looked at the packet again. "This is organized well." "I organized it last night," she said. He looked at her again. "You organized your own legal evidence. Is that a problem?" He thought about it. "It might actually be an advantage. You can explain it better than I can." He paused. "The railroad will have Clement Hargrove. He's brought up from Denver for anything that matters. He is not a nice man, and he is very good at making witnesses feel foolish in front of a room." "I'm not afraid of feeling foolish in front of a room," Vivian said. Pettiford looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, but something in his expression apparently communicated enough, because Pettiford turned back to Vivian and said, "All right then, let's go over the sequence." They had 40 minutes before the proceeding. They used all of them. The county courthouse in Broken Creek was a 2-story stone building that had been built with more optimism about the town's future than the town had yet justified. The main courtroom occupied most of the second floor. High windows, wooden benches, a judge's bench on a raised platform that was just elevated enough to establish hierarchy without being theatrical about it. By the time Caleb and Vivian arrived with Pettiford, the room was already more than half full. Vivian had not expected this. The railroad proceeding had apparently become a matter of general interest in Broken Creek, which she supposed made sense. A large company claiming a portion of a long-established family ranch was the kind of thing that made other landowners in the county sit up and pay attention, because what happened to the Mercers could happen to them. The benches held ranchers, merchants, a few women from the town, and in the back row grouped together with the quiet alertness of men who were present for professional rather than personal reasons, 4 men in railroad company attire. Gerald Foss was already seated on the far side of the room, and when Vivian came in, he looked at her with an attention that was careful and contained and not friendly. The Denver and Western's lead counsel, Clement Hargrove, was immediately identifiable. He was perhaps 50, well built in the way that suggested he'd kept himself in deliberate physical condition, and he had the particular bearing of a man who enters rooms expecting them to reconfigure around him. He was talking to 2 associates without looking up when Caleb and Vivian came in, and then something made him look up. Some peripheral awareness of the packet of documents under Vivian's arm, perhaps, or just the instinct of a competitive professional, and his eyes found her and stayed there for a moment before moving away. She sat down at the plaintiff's table beside Pettiford and placed the documents in front of her in the sequence she'd established. Her hands were steady. She was mildly surprised by this. Caleb sat beside her. His shoulder was close to hers. She could feel the warmth of it through the fabric of her coat, which shouldn't have mattered and did anyway. The plain animal comfort of not being alone in a room where the weight is against you. Judge Aldrich entered at 9 o'clock precisely. He was older than she'd expected, past 70, with the economy of movement that very old men develop when they've decided the body should spend its energy efficiently, and a face that had been watching people lie to him for 40 years and was not easily moved by anything short of evidence. He sat, arranged his papers, looked at the room once, and called the proceeding to order. Hargrove opened for the railroad. He was, as Pettiford had said, very good. He presented the Denver and Western's claim with the fluency of a man who has made this argument many times before. The federal right-of-way established by the Railroad Act, the survey conducted in accordance with federal standards, the measurements filed with the county land office and reviewed by the county agent, the legal precedent in the territory for railroad right-of-way superseding prior private deed. He was thorough and he was calm, and he gave the impression of a man making an argument that has already been decided in his favor and is simply being narrated for the court's benefit. Pettiford presented their counterclaim. He was steady, if not brilliant, and he followed the sequence exactly as they'd established. He introduced the original deed. He introduced the 1863 survey records. He noted the date discrepancy between the Mercer deed and the railroad survey. He was laying ground. Then he called Vivian. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. She still felt the particular quality of self-consciousness that comes from being looked at by a room full of people who have already formed an opinion of you. She stated her name, her former profession, her years of employment with the Missouri Pacific Railroad. Hargrove was on his feet before Pettiford finished the introduction. Your Honor, the relevance of the witness's previous employment is unclear. She is a mail-order bride recently arrived in this county with no established professional standing. Judge Aldrich looked at him. She's under oath, Hargrove. Let her tell us what she knows. Pettiford put the field notebooks on the table in front of the judge. Hargrove objected to their admissibility. Aldrich overruled the objection pending testimony establishing provenance. Vivian explained the notebooks, their purpose, their methodology, the notation system she had used, the training she had received, the professional context in which they were produced. She was careful and precise, and she did not look at Hargrove while she spoke. When she laid out the mathematical discrepancy, she did it exactly as she'd organized it the previous night, in sequence, in plain language, with the specific entries tabbed for the judge's reference. She explained what a 4-degree bearing variation meant over the distance in question. She put the resulting 340-foot error in concrete terms: the creek access, the flat eastern slope, the water that the ranch depended on. The room had been moderately attentive when she began. By the time she was halfway through the discrepancy analysis, it was very quiet. Judge Aldrich was reading the documents as she spoke. She had thought he was that kind of man, the kind who reads while listening rather than one or the other. And she had organized the packet to reward that habit, with each point she made verbally corresponding to a tab he could find immediately. Hargrove's cross-examination was what she had expected and prepared for. He questioned her credentials. She answered steadily. He questioned the chain of custody for the notebooks. She explained it clearly. He suggested that the notation discrepancies she'd identified could be the result of different measurement conventions between different railroad surveys. She walked him through, mathematically, why it couldn't be, why 4 degrees over that specific distance referenced against fixed federal benchmarks, produced a result that had only one possible explanation. "Mrs. Mercer," Hargrove said, with a patient smile that was not patient at all, "you've been in this county for less than 3 weeks. You arrived with no family, no resources, no professional standing, and you are asking this court to accept that you, a mail-order bride, a former railroad surveyor's assistant," she said, "who arrived by catalog arrangement. The method of my arrival is not relevant to the accuracy of the mathematics," she said. Her voice was level. "The numbers are what they are regardless of who presents them." There was a sound from the room behind her. Not a word, just a sound, a collective small shift, the sound a room makes when something unexpected happens. Hargrove changed approach. "These notebooks, you claim they date from your time with the Missouri Pacific. Do you have any independent verification that they weren't produced recently for the purposes of this proceeding?" "Yes," she said. She had expected this question. She'd thought about it carefully. She reached into the document packet and produced the letter from Walter Drummond. She also produced something else she hadn't mentioned to Pettiford, a document she'd found folded at the back of the first notebook when she'd gone through them at 2 in the morning. A receipt. A Missouri Pacific Supply receipt dated March 1877, made out to the surveying department with her name noted as the receiving assistant for a set of field notebooks of exactly the model she was presenting. The receipt was still tucked in the cover of the first notebook, where she'd placed it 9 years ago and apparently forgotten. She put both documents on the table. Hargrove looked at the receipt. His jaw didn't move. "The notebooks were issued to me officially in March of 1877, she said. "The receipt documents that. Mr. Drummond's letter, which I submit as Exhibit 4, confirms my employment and my professional documentation standard." She paused. "The notebook entries begin 2 days after the receipt date. The ink degradation is consistent with 9-year-old field ink, which any document examiner could verify." Hargrove looked at the receipt for a moment longer. Then he looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to request a brief recess." Aldrich looked at him. "You'll have it at noon, Hargrove. Continue." Hargrove continued, but something in his presentation had shifted, a very slight quality, like a man who has been walking with confidence across ground he believed to be solid and has just felt something move beneath one foot. He pivoted to the marker. "The physical marker your husband claims to have located on the eastern slope," he said. "Have you personally examined this marker?" "Yes." "And you claim it supports the Mercer deed boundary?" "It doesn't claim anything," Vivian said. "It's a stone with a surveyor's notation carved into it. The notation places the eastern boundary exactly where my father-in-law's 1863 deed indicates it should be, 340 feet east of where the Denver and Western Survey places it. You're asking this court to accept the word of a stone over a formally filed federal survey. I'm asking this court to consider which came first," she said. "The stone was placed in August of 1863 by R.C. Hollis, whose credentials as a federal deputy surveyor are a matter of public record. The railroad survey was filed in 1868, 5 years later." She looked at him directly. "The stone didn't move. If the 1868 survey contradicts a marker placed 5 years earlier by a respected federal surveyor, the question isn't whether to trust the stone. The question is why the 1868 survey differs from it." She heard Pettiford shift in his chair beside her. She thought it was because she'd gone slightly beyond what they'd rehearsed. She was probably right about that. She was also right about the argument. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. There was something in the look that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite hostility, but was somewhere between the two, the look of a professional encountering a problem that is more complicated than it appeared on paper. "I have no further questions at this time," he said. Vivian returned to her seat. Caleb didn't say anything, but his hand briefly touched the table near hers, not quite touching, a small gesture in a public room. The proceeding broke for noon. In the hallway, Pettiford pulled her aside. "You were extraordinary," he said, and she could tell he was surprised by it, which was all right. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "Hargrove hasn't presented his rebuttal yet. And—" he hesitated. "What?" Caleb said. Pettiford lowered his voice. "I heard 2 of the railroad's men talking before the break. They have something. I don't know what it is. But Hargrove requested the recess for a reason, and it wasn't to reconsider his position." Vivian felt the familiar cold alertness settle into her spine. They're going to attack my history. That's my guess, Pettiford said. Do you have anything in your past that I have a dead husband, 3 years of poverty, and a previous employer I haven't spoken to since I left railroad work, she said flatly. I don't know what story they've built out of that. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. I told you there were people I'd been avoiding. I told you that when I showed you the notebooks. I don't know what they've said to Hargrove, but whatever it is, it's designed to make the notebooks look tainted. Can they? Caleb said. They can try, she said. They ate nothing at noon. The afternoon session resumed at 1 o'clock. Hargrove called Gerald Foss. Foss testified with the comfortable authority of a man who had prepared for this. He confirmed, as county land agent, that he had personally reviewed the Denver and Western survey documents and found them to be consistent with federal standards. He described his professional experience. He noted that the regional benchmark records in the county land office, which he maintained, were consistent with the railroad's measurements. Pettiford cross-examined him on the benchmark records. Foss answered smoothly. Pettiford didn't push hard enough, and Vivian made a note on her paper that she slid in front of him. Ask him when the regional benchmark records were last updated and who updated them. And Pettiford looked at it and asked the question. Foss paused, just briefly. The records are updated as new surveys are filed. So the regional benchmark records in your office reflect the measurements in filed surveys, not independent verification. That's standard procedure. Which means, Pettiford said slowly, that if a filed survey contains an error, that error propagates into the benchmark records. The Denver and Western survey was filed in accordance with, thank you, Pettiford said. No further questions. It wasn't a kill shot, but it planted something. Then Hargrove called his final witness. The man who walked in from the side door was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, expensively dressed for a courthouse in a small Colorado town. Way to be there, and regarded the inconvenience as a professional investment. Vivian recognized him. The recognition moved through her like ice water. His name was Philip Corwin. He had been the regional contract supervisor for the Missouri Pacific during the latter half of her time there. The man who had controlled the surveying department's budget. The man who had, in the spring of 1880, accused her of falsifying her time records in order to justify a demotion that had nothing to do with her time records and everything to do with his discomfort at a woman who was better at the work than half his male staff. The accusation had been investigated and quietly dropped, but it had been made. It was in the Missouri Pacific's employment files, and Philip Corwin had apparently been contacted by someone in the last 8 days and had traveled from wherever he currently lived to sit in a Colorado courthouse and say so. She felt Caleb go still beside her. Corwin testified with the smooth confidence of a man who has composed his version of events over time until it has the weight of truth in his own mind. He described Vivian's employment. He described the time record accusation. He described the investigation in carefully vague terms that implied wrongdoing without specifying it. He concluded by expressing his professional opinion that field notebooks attributable to Vivian Hale should be viewed with caution by any proceeding relying on their accuracy. The room was quiet in a different way now. Pettiford was already writing. He slid the paper to Vivian. Do you want to respond directly? Judge can allow a brief response. She wrote back, yes, ask for it. Pettiford stood. Your Honor, given the nature of this testimony, I'd request that Mrs. Mercer be permitted to respond briefly. Aldrich looked at Hargrove. Hargrove considered objecting and visibly decided against it, perhaps because objecting would look as though he feared the response. Briefly, Aldrich said. Vivian stood. She looked at Corwin for a moment. He looked back with the settled expression of a man who believes he has done what he came to do. Mr. Corwin investigated the time record accusation he's described, she said, addressing the judge, not Corwin. The investigation was concluded in February of 1880. I have the Missouri Pacific's official letter of conclusion, which states in writing that the matter was closed with no finding of wrongdoing. She reached into the document packet. The letter was there. She had almost not packed it. She had packed it at 1 a.m, on instinct, before the note had arrived at the gate, and she was deeply grateful for the instinct now. I'd like to submit this as Exhibit 5. She set it on the table. Aldrich read it. His face didn't change, but his eyes moved through it with the speed of a man reading something he finds significant. Mr. Corwin, Aldrich said without looking up from the letter, This letter says the accusation was closed with no finding. The closing of the investigation doesn't, Corwin began. It says no finding, Aldrich said. He set the letter down. You've told this court that Mrs. Mercer's notebook should be viewed with caution based on an investigation that produced no finding. Is that the sum of your testimony? Corwin's jaw tightened. My professional opinion, your professional opinion, Aldrich said, is an opinion. The document she's submitted is a conclusion. He looked back at his papers. Thank you for your time. The room shifted. Hargrove stood for his closing argument and made it well. He was too professional to collapse under the weight of the morning, and he reframed the narrative with skill. The railroad survey was formally filed and officially maintained. The counter-evidence was produced by a recently arrived woman with a contested employment history. The physical marker had not been verified by an independent federal surveyor, and the court should apply the standard of established legal procedure rather than the testimony of interested parties. Pettiford made his closing. I was better than he'd been in the morning, steadier, and he built it around the single point Vivian had given him. That the benchmark records in the county land office reflected filed surveys rather than independent verification, and that if the 1868 survey was inaccurate, the benchmark records were inaccurate, and the railroad's self-referencing documentation proved nothing except that an error, once filed, had been successfully filed twice. Aldrich said he would take the matter under advisement. He also said something else. I want an independent surveyor to examine the physical marker, he said. One appointed by this court, not by either party. The marker will not be disturbed until that examination is complete. He looked at Hargrove. I assume the Denver and Western has no objection to an independent examination of a marker they claim is irrelevant. There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything. Of course not, Hargrove said. Good, Aldrich said. We'll reconvene in 5 days. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon had gone cold, and the light was flattening to the gray of late afternoon. People came out around them, talking in the lower registers of people processing something surprising. Vivian heard fragments, never thought, and she held her ground. And one woman's voice, undisguised, I'd like to see them try that with my husband's land now. Pettiford shook her hand with both of his. 5 days, he said. If the independent surveyor finds what I think he'll find. He will, Vivian said. She was tired. More tired than she'd let herself feel during the proceeding, the specific deep tiredness that comes after sustained controlled fear. Her legs were not entirely steady. Caleb walked with her to the wagon. When they reached it, he stopped and looked at her for a moment with the directness that was his natural mode of attention. You all right? He said. I will be, she said. He helped her up to the wagon seat, which he hadn't done before, and she accepted the help without comment because her body was asking for it, and she had gotten better, in the last 3 weeks, at accepting things that were offered honestly. They drove out of Broken Creek in the fading light. After a while, Caleb said, That letter, the one clearing you. Yes. You almost didn't pack it. She looked at him. How did you know that? Because you pack carefully. You had that suitcase organized in a specific way, and the letter was loose in the outside pocket like you'd added it at the last minute. She was quiet for a moment. 1 in the morning, she said. I nearly left it behind. He drove for a while without speaking. Then, what made you take it? She thought about that. I've learned, she said slowly, that the things you'd most like to leave behind are usually the ones you need to carry. The ranch came into view at the end of the road. Light in the kitchen window, the faint sound carried on the cold air of children inside. 5 days for the independent surveyor. 5 days of waiting, of Foss and Hargrove and whoever else had decided that a thin woman with a suitcase was a problem to be managed. 5 days before Aldrich reconvened the proceeding and the court-appointed man came back from the eastern slope with the measurement they already knew he'd find. Probably. Nothing was certain, she knew that. But the letter was in evidence, the notebooks were in evidence, Drummond's statement was in evidence, and somewhere on that slope above the creek bend, buried under 26 years of brush, R.C. Hollis's stone marker stood exactly where it had always stood, waiting for someone to ask it the right question. She had asked it. Now they waited for the answer to reach the right ears. The 5 days moved the way difficult waiting always moves. Not slowly exactly, but unevenly, with some hours stretching long and others collapsing without warning into the next. Vivian kept herself busy because the alternative was sitting with the uncertainty, which she'd never been good at. She organized the kitchen. She helped Owen with his schoolwork. She sat with May through 2 consecutive evenings of bedtime stories, reading from a dog-eared collection of frontier tales that the children had apparently memorized well enough to catch her if she skipped a line. She slept better than she expected, which surprised her until she realized that the proceeding had released something. Not resolved it, but released the particular tension of anticipation, replaced it with a different tension that at least had a fixed end date. Caleb was quieter than usual, which she'd learned meant he was running calculations. Not mathematical ones, but the internal kind, the ones men run when they're trying to estimate outcomes and keep arriving at the same uncomfortable margin of uncertainty. He didn't talk much about the proceeding. He kept working because the ranch didn't pause for legal proceedings, and the fence on the north pasture needed attention regardless of what was happening in county court. On the second day, Walter Drummond arrived. He came in on the afternoon train from Denver, and Caleb drove to the station to collect him while Vivian stayed at the ranch and made dinner and tried not to read too much into the fact that he'd come in person rather than relying on his letter. She told herself the letter was enough. But when she heard the wagon come into the yard and looked out the kitchen window and saw an older man getting down from the seat, white-haired, heavy-set, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose knees had opinions about wagon travel, she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Drummond came inside and shook her hand and looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze she remembered from years ago. The gaze of a man who looked at things the way surveyors look at things, precisely, without sentiment, interested only in what was actually there. "You look thin," he said. "I've been thinner," she said. "The notebooks are good?" "The notebooks are what they are. You verified them." "I verified your work when you were employed," he said. "I'll verify it again if Aldrich needs it." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Clara brought him with a nod of thanks that Clara received with the solemnity of a girl doing her job. "Tell me about the county land agent." She told him about Foss. She told him about the benchmark records. She watched Drummond's expression sharpen as she described the way the county records reflected filed surveys rather than independent verification. And when she finished, he sat for a moment tapping one blunt finger on the table. "That's the mechanism," he said. "Yes. If Foss updated the regional benchmark records to reflect the railroad's 1868 survey rather than the original federal markers, then the entire evidentiary chain the railroad is relying on is circular," Vivian said. "Their survey cites the county benchmarks. The county benchmarks were updated to reflect their survey. It's the same measurement referenced twice and called independent confirmation." Drummond looked at her. "Did you tell Pettiford this?" "Not in those exact terms." "Tell him in those exact terms," Drummond said. "That's the argument that ends this." He stayed 3 days sleeping in the spare room that had been Owen's until Owen was temporarily relocated to share with Thomas, who accepted this with the resigned composure of a boy who understands that adults have needs that supersede bedroom arrangements. Drummond turned out to be excellent company, direct, dryly funny, and possessed of a collection of survey disaster stories that kept even Thomas entertained across 2 dinners. He treated Vivian's knowledge as what it was, which was professional expertise, not a curiosity or an accomplishment to be noted with surprise, and she found that she hadn't realized how much she'd missed being treated that way until it happened again. On the 3rd evening, Caleb came back from town with news. The court-appointed independent surveyor had completed his examination of the marker. His name was James Cafferty, appointed from the county surveying office 2 towns west, and he had spent the better part of 2 days on the eastern slope. Caleb had spoken to Pettiford, who had spoken to Cafferty's assistant. The details were informal, unconfirmed, the kind of half-information that travels through small towns before anything official has happened. But the assistant had said to Pettiford that Cafferty's measurements of the Hollis marker placed the true eastern boundary of the Mercer property at exactly the location described in the 1863 deed, not approximately, exactly. Vivian absorbed this in the kitchen with Drummond beside her and Caleb across the table. "He'll file his report with Aldrich tomorrow," Caleb said. "Does Hargrove know?" Drummond asked. "He will by morning. The railroad has people watching everything that moves in this county." Caleb looked at Vivian. "Pettiford thinks Hargrove may try to file a motion to delay. challenge Cafferty's methodology or credentials before the report can be formally submitted. Can he? Vivian asked. Pettiford says he can try. Whether Aldrich allows it, Aldrich appointed Cafferty, Drummond said flatly. Hargrove challenges the methodology. He's challenging the judge's choice of examiner. Aldrich will not enjoy that. Caleb looked at Drummond with the expression of a man reassessing a guess value upward. That's what Pettiford said, almost word for word. Pettiford's not as useless as you thought he was, Drummond said. He wasn't useless, Caleb said. He was just working without enough information. Drummond made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, which seemed to be his default response to statements he found partially correct. The fifth day came. They drove into Broken Creek in the early morning again, this time with Drummond on the seat beside Caleb, the three of them in a row. The children stood in the yard to watch them go, all four of them, and May waved until the wagon turned the road curve and the ranch was out of sight. Vivian looked back once, at the house and the barn and the eastern hills just visible beyond the pasture fence, and felt with sudden, uncomfortable clarity exactly what was at stake. Not just the land was the practical reality. But behind it, the children growing up on that property. Thomas developing whatever he was going to become. Owen's maps pinned to his bedroom wall. May's rabbits in the yard. The fabric of ordinary life that had been assembled through 11 years of Caleb Mercer's work and 2 years of struggle after Margaret died, and 3 weeks, so far, of Vivian's own effort. All of it rested on a line carved into a stone on a hillside in 1863. She turned back to the road. The courthouse was fuller than the first proceeding. Word had traveled, the way word travels in small counties, comprehensively and fast, and the benches held more people than before. She recognized faces from town. Helen Gruber was there, in the third row, watching the room with the assessing attention of a woman taking notes she would distribute later. Several ranchers she'd seen in passing but hadn't met. 2 men she didn't recognize who had the look of newspaper correspondents, notebooks in hand. Hargrove had brought a second associate. She noted this. It was either preparation or performance, and with men like Hargrove it was usually both. Aldrich called the proceeding to order at 9. Cafferty presented his findings first. He was a compact, methodical man in his 40s who had clearly been doing this work long enough to have no patience for courtroom theater. He described his examination of the marker in the same measured language Vivian would have used, and his measurements, taken independently, using federal reference instruments, placed the lawless marker in a position that contradicted the Denver and Western's claimed boundary line by 337 feet. 3 feet less than her calculation. She'd used different equipment, working from field notes rather than direct measurement. 3 feet over that distance was well within the margin she'd expected. Hargrove cross-examined Cafferty with the particular care of a man who knows he's dealing with a court-appointed witness and cannot push too hard without damaging his relationship with the judge. He questioned measurement methodology. Cafferty answered with the patient precision of someone who has been questioned by lawyers before and finds them, professionally, unimpressive. He questioned whether the marker could have shifted over 26 years of soil movement. Cafferty explained in clear, non-technical terms why the configuration of the marker, 3 large flat stones with the vertical marker stone embedded in compacted subsoil to a depth of 14 inches, made natural movement impossible without visible disturbance that was not present. Hargrove returned to his table. Then Aldrich did something Vivian hadn't expected. He looked at Vivian directly, not at Pettiford, at her, and said, "Mrs. Mercer, Mr. Cafferty's measurement and yours differ by 3 feet. Would you like to explain that discrepancy for the record?" She stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My measurement was derived by cross-referencing field notebook coordinates against known benchmark distances rather than by direct physical measurement of the marker. The 3-foot variation is consistent with the error margin inherent in coordinate cross-referencing over long distances. A direct measurement of the marker, which is what Mr. Cafferty performed, is more precise than a coordinate calculation. His measurement supersedes mine. The conclusion, that the railroad's claimed boundary is approximately 337 feet west of the actual boundary established by the 1863 marker, is the same." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. "You're correcting yourself in favor of the opposing measurement." "I'm correcting myself in favor of accuracy," she said. The 3-foot difference doesn't change the outcome. The principle of agreeing with a more precise measurement over a less precise one is just good science. Something in the room shifted. She couldn't see it, but she felt it. The particular quality of attention changing when people recalibrate their understanding of what they're watching. She sat down. Drummond leaned across Caleb and said, very quietly, "Good." Pettiford then made an argument that she had helped him construct the previous evening, using Drummond's framing. He laid it out cleanly. The Denver and Western survey cited the county benchmark records as independent corroboration. The county benchmark records were maintained by Gerald Foss, who had testified to reviewing the railroad survey personally. The timeline showed that the county benchmark records had been updated in the spring of 1869. He had the county records ledger, obtained that morning, 6 months after the railroad survey was filed, which meant the regional benchmark records in the county land office did not predate the Denver and Western survey. They postdated it. The room was very still. The railroad survey, Pettiford said, with a steadiness that surprised Vivian, cites county benchmark records as independent confirmation. Those county benchmark records were updated after the railroad survey was filed. The Denver and Western is citing their own measurements as their own confirmation. The circular nature of this evidence chain means that their entire documentary case rests not on independent verification, but on a single set of measurements. Measurements that contradict a federal marker placed by a respected deputy surveyor 5 years before the railroad survey was conducted. He paused. "That marker has not moved," he said. "The mathematics have not changed. What changed in 1868 and again in 1869 were the numbers on paper. And numbers on paper can be altered. Stone cannot." Hargrove's closing was forceful and technically sophisticated, and it didn't have anywhere to go. He made the arguments he had available, procedural, precedential, jurisdictional. But the foundation had been moved, and he was building on air. He was good enough to make the air look solid from a certain angle, but the room had heard Cafferty, and the room had heard about the benchmark records, and the room was full of people who owned land and understood, viscerally, what circular self-referencing documentation meant for their own property lines. Aldrich did not take this one under advisement. He sat for a long moment looking at his papers. The room was so quiet that Vivian could hear the building settle, the small contractions of old wood in the cold. Then Aldrich looked up. "The independent examination of the lawless marker," he said, "places the eastern boundary of the Mercer property in a location consistent with the 1863 deed and inconsistent with the Denver and Western Railroad survey of 1868. The county benchmark records, as demonstrated by the plaintiff's counsel, postdate the railroad survey and cannot function as independent corroboration." He set his papers down. "The Denver and Western Railroad's claim to right-of-way on the Mercer Eastern pasture is not supported by the evidence before this court. The claim is dismissed." He picked up his pen, made a notation, set it down. "Furthermore," he said, and the room got quieter still, "the discrepancy between the lawless marker and the railroad survey, combined with the documented timeline of the county benchmark record updates, presents questions this court is not equipped to resolve, but which warrant referral to the federal land office for investigation." He looked at Hargrove. "The Denver and Western will be notified of this referral in writing." Hargrove's face was professionally composed. Beneath the composition, something that was not composed was happening. "Court adjourned," Aldrich said. The room broke. Not loudly, not the way rooms break in stories where everyone cheers at once, but in the human way where different people do different things simultaneously. Some people stood immediately. Some sat still for a moment. There was talking, voices layering over each other. Pettiford was shaking Caleb's hand and saying something Vivian didn't catch because she was sitting very still at the table with her hands flat on the surface. She was not composed in the way she had been for the last 8 days. The composure had done its job, and now, without the proceeding ahead of her, it had let go, and what was underneath it was complicated. Relief? Yes, but relief with texture. The texture of a person who has spent 3 years in freefall and has just touched solid ground and needs a moment to determine whether the ground is actually solid or whether they're simply too tired to feel the movement. Caleb sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't shake her hand or make a statement. He just sat down, which was exactly right. After a moment, she said, "He referred it to the federal land office." "Yes." "That means they'll investigate Foss." Probably. And the railroad's other survey filings in this region. Probably, Caleb said again. She looked at him. This could be bigger than just our land. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a problem? She thought about it, about all the ranchers in the room behind them, about the woman whose voice she'd heard outside after the first proceeding. I'd like to see them try that with my husband's land now. About the benchmark records that Foss had updated in the spring of 1869, and whether the Denver and Western had filed any other surveys before or after that date, and how many other property lines in this county rested on documentation that pointed only at itself. No, she said, it's not a problem. Drummond appeared at her shoulder. He put his hand on top of hers on the table briefly, the gesture of an old professional who doesn't express things easily and chooses physical contact instead. Then he straightened up. Aldrich is a good judge, he said, to no one in particular. He is, Vivian agreed. They stood and turned, and the room was there. Helen Gruber was standing near the aisle with the expression of a woman substantially revising a position she'd held publicly, which was costing her something and which she was paying anyway. She caught Vivian's eye. There was a pause. Then she nodded. Not warmly, not with the gushing reversal of someone who wanted credit for changing her mind. Just a nod. An acknowledgement. Woman to woman, across a room that had just watched something unexpected happen. Vivian nodded back. Outside, the cold was sharp after the close air of the courthouse. Pettiford was talking to two of the ranchers from the benches who had apparently been waiting to speak to him, and from the quality of the conversation, she could tell they were asking about their own land records. She looked at that and thought, it starts like this, with someone asking a question. A reporter from the county paper approached. He was young, nervous, holding his notebook the way young reporters hold notebooks when they haven't yet decided how much of the story they understand. He asked Caleb several questions, and Caleb answered them briefly and accurately, and then the reporter turned to Vivian and said, with the barely disguised uncertainty of a young man improvising, Mrs. Mercer, you were a railroad surveyor's assistant before you came here. Did you come here specifically because of this situation? Did you know about the land dispute before? No, she said, but your skills were not the reason I came to Broken Creek, she said. I came because I had nowhere else to go. She looked at him evenly. The skills were just what I happened to have. Most people have something. They don't always know when it's going to matter. The reporter wrote this down. She didn't know whether it would appear in print and didn't particularly care, but it was true. And she'd found in the last month that saying true things in plain language was, on balance, the most efficient approach. Hargrove passed them on the courthouse steps. He was moving quickly, his two associates at his flanks, already in the mode of a man managing consequences. He would have telegrams to send, superiors to inform, a referral to the federal land office to characterize to the Denver and Western in whatever way minimized its implications. He had a full afternoon of difficult professional communication ahead of him, and he was already in it. He didn't stop. But as he passed, he looked at Vivian directly, and there was something in the look, not the hostile framing of his cross-examination, not the attorney's performance. Something more plain than that. The look of a man encountering someone he had underestimated and having the straightforwardness to register it without pretending otherwise. He walked on. She didn't attribute anything generous to the look. It wasn't respect exactly, but it was honest, and she'd learned to take honesty in whatever form it came. Drummond departed on the afternoon train. He shook Caleb's hand at the station and told him the property was solid, and the deed was clean, and he should fence that eastern slope properly before spring. Then he turned to Vivian. Your husband's land, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You look a little better than you did when you walked into my office in St. Louis, he said. It wasn't exactly a compliment. It was an observation, which from Drummond was more valuable. I'm eating regularly, she said. Good. He picked up his bag. Write to me if there's anything else. I will. He boarded the train, and that was that. On the drive back to the ranch, the light was going the way it went in late March, earlier than summer, the sky purpling at the edges while there was still an hour left in the day. Caleb drove and Vivian sat beside him and thought about the thing Pettiford had said to her in the hallway after the proceeding, which she hadn't fully processed in the business of the afternoon. He'd said, The federal referral is going to create complications for the railroad that go well beyond this county. There are surveyors in this territory who will have to answer for their work. There are land agents who will have to account for their records. He'd paused. You understand that your notebooks may be requested as part of that investigation. She'd said she understood. She did understand. The notebooks going into a federal investigation was a different thing from the notebooks going into a county proceeding. It meant her name, her history, her 6 years of Missouri Pacific work, all of it examined by people with the authority and the patience to look at it thoroughly. It meant Corwin's accusation looked at again by people who had access to the full employment record, not just the version Corwin had chosen to narrate. That was uncomfortable. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But it also meant a great many property lines in this region would be looked at honestly, possibly for the first time since 1868. And if there were other Mercer ranches out there, other families sitting on falsified records, other county land agents who had updated their benchmark files at the railroad's convenience, those families deserved to know it. She'd made her peace with this somewhere between the courthouse and the station. You're quiet, Caleb said. Thinking, she said. About what? Pettiford told me the federal investigation will probably want my notebooks. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Is that all right? It's the right thing, she said. Whether it's all right is a secondary question. He nodded. They drove in silence for a while. The road wound through the low hills and the cold air came off the mountains to the west. And somewhere ahead the ranch lights would be on by now because Clara always lit the lamps early and the children would be waiting. There's something I've been thinking, Caleb said. What? He kept his eyes on the road. He had the quality of a man choosing words carefully, not because he was uncertain of them, but because he wanted them to land correctly. When you came off that train, he said, I thought I was doing you a kindness, taking you in. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that was the frame I had, that I was offering something and you were accepting it. She waited. I was wrong about the frame, he said. That's all. She looked at his profile against the darkening sky, the set of his jaw, the way he held the reins, loose-handed, the way confident drivers do, because they've made 1,000 small corrections over years, and the corrections are automatic now. You were offering something, she said. You were also right that I was accepting it. But you brought things with you, he said, things that mattered. And I didn't see that. I thought I was the one providing. You were providing, she said. Safety, stability, a place. She paused. I brought what I happened to have. I know, he said. I'm saying it mattered. She looked at the road ahead of them. It did, she said. The ranch came into view. The kitchen lamp was burning, warm and clear through the window. As they came through the gate, May appeared on the porch. Apparently she'd been watching the road again, the same post she'd taken up on the morning Vivian first arrived. And when the wagon was close enough, she shouted something that was probably a question about what had happened, but came out mostly as noise. Thomas was in the yard. He came to take the horse's head as Caleb brought the wagon to a stop, and he looked up at his father and said quietly, Well? We won, Caleb said. Thomas looked at this for a moment, absorbing it, processing it, the way he did everything. Then he looked at Vivian. She met his eyes. He nodded. It was the same nod he'd given her in the kitchen that morning before the first proceeding. Weighted, not casual, the nod of a boy deciding something. But this one was different. This one didn't have reservation in it. This one was simply decided. Good, he said. He led the horse to the barn. Inside, Clara had made supper, which was waiting with the patient warmth of food cooked by someone who knew you'd be hungry when you arrived. Owen was at the table with his maps. He'd been drawing, Vivian saw, a detailed rendering of the Mercer property with the Hollis marker noted and labeled. He'd written the coordinates in the margin in the notation she'd taught him, precisely correct. May was explaining something to anyone who would listen, which was everyone, which was also no one, because May's explanations didn't require an audience to proceed. Vivian sat down at the table and felt the solidity of the house around her. The weight of the walls, the warmth of the stove, the familiar creak of the floorboard near the window. She had been in this house for less than a month. She had arrived in it thin and exhausted and apologetic, with one suitcase and no real plan beyond surviving another season. The suitcase was still in the corner of the bedroom because she hadn't gotten around to buying a proper chest. The notebooks were going to a federal investigation. The eastern boundary was going to be re-fenced in the spring, properly, with Cafferty's measurements as the legal reference. And outside, somewhere in the darkening hills east of the property, a stone marker stood in the ground where R.C. Hollis had left it 26 years ago, waiting to matter, which it finally had. Caleb sat down across from her and caught her looking at Owen's map. "He's been working on that all day," Caleb said. "The coordinates are right," Vivian said. "Of course they are," Caleb said. And there was something in the way he said it, quiet, matter of fact, the tone of a man who has simply updated his understanding of what his children are capable of and is not surprised by it. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. Outside the window, the last light was leaving the sky, and inside the kitchen the lamps burned steady, and none of it felt like triumph. It felt more ordinary than that, more human, the way good things feel when they've been earned slowly and at cost, and have arrived without ceremony, just the plain fact of them, sitting at the table alongside everything else. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was warm. Spring came late that year, the way it often did in the high country, tentatively, in fits, with cold snapping back just when the ground had started to soften and the grass had begun to consider returning. But it came. It always came. Caleb refenced the eastern boundary in the second week of April, using Cafferty's measurements as the legal reference, and Thomas alongside him for the entire 3 days of work. Vivian watched them from the kitchen window on the first morning, the two of them moving down the slope together with the post driver and the wire spool, and she thought about how work done side by side between a father and a son is its own kind of conversation, the kind that doesn't need words because the shared effort says what words would approximate anyway. The new fence line ran 337 feet east of where the Denver and Western had tried to claim it. When it was done, Caleb came in from the cold and washed his hands at the pump and said simply, "That's done." And it was. The federal investigation took longer. Letters arrived through April and into May, from the federal land office in Denver, from a department Vivian hadn't previously had occasion to interact with, asking specific questions about specific entries in her notebooks, requesting clarifications of notation, asking her to confirm dates and reference numbers. She answered each one carefully and completely, cross-referencing her memory against the originals, and when she wasn't certain of something she said so, because the investigation's value depended on the accuracy of what went into it, and she wasn't willing to shade anything for convenience. Drummond wrote twice. The second letter said that the federal investigation had identified discrepancies in 4 additional survey filings in the region, all associated with the Denver and Western, all filed within a 5-year window following the regional benchmark record update that Pettiford had exposed in court. 4 other ranching families in the county were going to have questions answered about their property lines, or rather questions answered that they hadn't yet known to ask. Vivian read this letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Owen ate breakfast beside her, and she showed him the relevant paragraph because he was old enough to understand it, and because she had decided early on that information shouldn't be withheld from children simply because it belonged to the adult world. Owen read it and looked up and said, "So it wasn't just us." "No," she said, "it wasn't just us." He thought about this. Did those other families know they might be losing land? I don't think so. So they were in trouble and didn't know it. Yes. Owen sat with this for a moment. He was 9 now. His birthday had come and gone in April with a cake Clara made that listed slightly to one side and tasted excellent, and the quality of his thinking had continued to develop in the direction it had always been pointing, toward the precise and the structural, the kind of mind that is happiest when it understands how things connect. Then the marker mattered for them too, he said. Not just us, even though they didn't know about it. That's right, Vivian said. He picked up his fork and went back to his eggs, apparently satisfied. She looked at him and felt the particular quiet tenderness of watching a person learn something real. Not a lesson from a book, but an understanding of how the world actually works. The way one true thing, properly documented and properly argued, can move consequences further than you can see from where you're standing. Gerald Foss resigned from his position as county land agent in May. The resignation was quiet. No public statement, no newspaper account beyond a brief notice in the county paper. He left Broken Creek within a week of the resignation. Where he went, Vivian didn't know and didn't pursue. The federal investigation would find him if it needed to. That wasn't her business. Her business had been the evidence, and the evidence had been delivered, and what happened afterward was in other hands now. This was something she'd had to consciously accept because the part of her that had spent 6 years cross-referencing measurements for accuracy wanted to follow every thread to its conclusion. She had to remind herself more than once that following threads to their conclusion was the investigation's job, not hers. She had given them what she had. That was the right place to stop. The town's relationship with Vivian shifted, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but in the incremental way that small communities revise their understanding of people they've misjudged. Helen Gruber stopped her on the sidewalk one afternoon in early May and asked, with the brisk directness of a woman who has decided to do something and wants to get through it efficiently, whether Vivian might have an interest in joining the County Women's Literacy Committee, which met on the second Thursday of every month, and was attempting to organize a small lending library for the outlying ranch families. Vivian said she would think about it. Helen said, "We could use someone with a practical mind. Most of us are better at enthusiasm than organization." Vivian said, "I'll come to the next meeting." She did. The committee was 8 women in Helen's back parlor, drinking tea that was too strong and arguing productively about which books to prioritize. Vivian listened for the first half of the meeting and made 3 suggestions in the second half, 2 of which were adopted immediately and 1 of which prompted a debate that lasted the rest of the evening. She drove home afterward in the late light and felt something that she eventually identified as belonging. Not the desperate version, not the performed version, but the quiet kind that arrives without announcement. Clara noticed everything. She was washing dishes when Vivian got back, and she turned and looked at her stepmother with her particular evaluative attention and said, "You look different." "How?" Vivian said. Clara considered it seriously. "Less like you're waiting to find out if something's going to go wrong." Vivian stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with that. "That's a good observation," she said. "I observe things," Clara said, and went back to the dishes. The summer that followed was not easy in all the ways that frontier summers are not easy. The work was constant, the weather was demanding. There were 2 weeks in July when the creek ran lower than Caleb had ever seen it, and they moved the cattle 3 times in 10 days, and everyone was short-tempered and tired. There was a night in August when Thomas and Caleb had an argument that started about fence repairs and became about something else entirely, the accumulated pressure of a boy becoming a man in close quarters with his father, and Vivian stayed out of it and let it run its course, which took 2 days and ended with the 2 of them working silently side by side again, and neither of them mentioning it. She had learned that families have their own weather, their own pressures and resolutions, and her job was not to fix every storm, but to be a stable element within them. She was not their mother. She was not trying to be. She was the woman who had come with 1 suitcase and stayed, and what that meant was still being defined, slowly, by everyone involved. May had long since stopped defining it at all, and simply treated Vivian as a fundamental feature of her world, the way children absorb new constants into their reality with a completeness that adults never quite manage. She climbed into Vivian's lap when she felt like it, fell asleep against her shoulder during the long evenings, and periodically informed her of important facts about rabbits, weather, and the characters in her own ongoing imaginative narratives, with the assumption that Vivian would find all of this as interesting as she did. Vivian did find it interesting. This also surprised her, the way several things about the preceding months had surprised her. The discovery that she had more capacity for ordinary life than she'd thought, after years of survival mode. That warmth, properly offered, could be accepted without the specific terror of losing it again. That she was not, as she had sometimes believed during the worst years in St. Louis, someone the world had finished with. She thought about this one evening in late August, sitting on the porch after supper while the last light went out of the sky. Caleb was beside her. The children were inside. The eastern hills were dark shapes against the darkening sky, and somewhere up on that slope, covered again in brush because they hadn't seen any reason to advertise it, R.C. Hollis's marker sat in the ground where it had always been. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "When you wrote back to the register, after my first letter, the one where I told you about the illness and the poverty and the lack of family." She paused. "You wrote back, 'Come anyway.' What made you do that?" He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't the kind of man who answered quickly when the question mattered. You were honest, he said, in a way people usually aren't when they want something. Most people present the best version of themselves when they're trying to be chosen. You presented what was actually true and let me decide. That could have gotten me no response at all. It could have, he said, but it told me something about who you were. Someone who'll be honest when honesty costs them something is someone you can rely on. He looked out at the hills. I needed someone I could rely on more than I needed someone impressive. She sat with this. I wasn't trying to be impressive, she said. I just didn't have the energy to be dishonest. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I know, that's part of what I mean. They sat for a while in the dark. The notebooks, she said, when I handed them to you on that slope, you gave them back. You said it was my choice. It was your choice. Most men wouldn't have said that. Most men would have been wrong, he said simply. She looked at him. He was watching the hills, the particular outward attention of a man who is also paying attention to something inward, the double focus she'd come to recognize as his version of feeling something he didn't have words for yet. I brought the notebooks because I didn't throw things away that might matter, she said. But I stayed because of that moment, because you gave them back. He turned and looked at her. In the dark, his face was quiet and serious and genuine, which was how his face looked when it wasn't managing anything. Good reason to stay, he said. She looked back at the hills. Yes, she said. It was. Thomas came to her that September with a question she hadn't anticipated. He'd been out to the lawless marker on his own. He told her this matter-of-factly, the way he told her most things, directly and without preamble. He'd taken Owen's map and Cafferty's measurements and gone up on a Saturday afternoon and found it and sat with it for a while. I want to learn to do what you did, he said, not just the legal part, the surveying part, the actual mathematics of it, reading the land against the numbers. She looked at him. He was almost 15 now, and the angular teenager was starting to fill into something broader and more settled, the way young men do when they're growing into their actual shape. Why? She asked. Because what you showed with those notebooks, he said, is that someone who knows how to read the land correctly can protect people who don't know they need protecting. He said it simply, without drama. I want to know how to do that. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 4 other ranch families whose property lines were being reviewed by the federal investigation. She thought about the way Pettiford had said in the hallway after the proceeding that the referral to the federal land office could affect claims across the territory. She thought about Drummond, 30 years of work, his reputation used as a reference in courtrooms because his measurements could be trusted absolutely. She thought about R.C. Hollis, dead decades now, whose careful work in August of 1863 had been the one fixed point around which everything else had turned. It takes years, she said. I know. You'd need formal training eventually, not just what I can teach you. I know that too. And it's not a popular profession for a young man in this territory right now. There are more opportunities in cattle or commerce. I know, Thomas said, with the patience of someone who has already considered the objections and found them insufficient. I still want to learn. She looked at him for a long moment. This boy who had stood at the barn window when she first arrived, who had told her he'd think about accepting her and had done exactly that, thought about it carefully, and then decided. His mother's children, she had come to understand, had been raised to think carefully and decide honestly, and that was the best thing Margaret Mercer had left behind. Then we start on Monday, Vivian said. They did. She taught him the way she'd been taught, not by explaining first and practicing second, but by doing, from the first day, with the explanation coming as they worked. She started with the notation system, because notation was the foundation, the language in which the land's truth was recorded, and if you didn't have the language, you couldn't read what the land said. Thomas was quick, quicker than she'd expected, though she should have expected it, because Owen had been quick too, and these children came from a particular kind of intelligence. Owen, for his part, absorbed everything Thomas learned within approximately 48 hours of Thomas learning it, because he sat at the same table during the lessons and appeared to be drawing maps of his own imagining while actually listening to every word. She caught this on the 3rd session and changed her approach to include him directly, which he received with the composure of someone who had been waiting to be acknowledged and wasn't surprised when it happened. By October, they were going out to the east pasture with a compass and a measuring chain and making their own recordings of the boundary markers. And their work was good. Not professional quality yet, not the kind you'd stake a legal claim on, but good, honest, careful work that reflected genuine understanding of what they were doing and why. Caleb watched this from a middle distance. He didn't involve himself, which was right. It wasn't his domain, and he knew it. But she noticed the quality of his watching, the particular attention of a father, watching his children become things he hadn't anticipated and finding it better than what he'd planned. One afternoon, he came out to where she and Thomas were working the northern line, and he stood watching for a while, and then he said to Thomas, "You know what you're doing?" Thomas looked up from the compass. "Getting there," he said. Caleb nodded. He looked at Vivian. She looked back. No words necessary. They had developed this over the months, a shorthand, the compression of shared context, the way people who have been through something together can communicate the relevant thing in a look. Winter came. The ranch contracted inward the way ranches do in cold weather, everyone closer to the house, the daily rhythm narrowing to the essential. Vivian had been through one full cycle of seasons on the Mercer Ranch now, and knew what December felt like here, the quality of the cold coming off the mountains, the particular sound the wind made through the gap in the barn door that Caleb kept meaning to fix and kept not getting to. She had a chest for her clothes now. She'd bought it in October, a solid pine chest from the furniture maker in Broken Creek, and she'd moved the last of her things out of the worn suitcase and put them in it. The suitcase she'd kept, folded the cracked leather flat, and set it on the shelf in the bedroom closet, because she wasn't someone who threw away things that had carried her through hard times. The notebooks were gone. The Federal Land Office had sent a formal receipt for them in November, with a letter confirming that they had been entered as evidence into the regional survey investigation and would be retained in the Federal Archive following the investigation's conclusion. She'd read the letter and then folded it and put it in the chest with her other documents, and she had felt their absence, the notebooks, the way you feel the absence of something you've carried for a long time. Not grief exactly. More like the sense of weight lifted that takes a few weeks to feel normal. They had done what they were supposed to do. More, probably, than she'd known when she'd carried them out of a boarding house in St. Louis with no clear plan. Christmas came and went. Clara made a meal that was ambitious and imperfect and wonderful. May received a rag doll from Vivian and a set of wooden animals from Caleb and spent the day making them interact in scenarios of increasing complexity. Owen received a professional surveyor's field notebook, the real kind, with the gridded paper and the durable cover, which he opened with the expression of someone receiving exactly the thing they wanted without having said so. Thomas received a book on federal land survey law that Vivian had ordered from Denver in October, which he looked at for a long moment and then set on the table beside him with the specific care of someone handling something they intend to use for a long time. On the first morning of the new year, Caleb went out to the barn early and came back an hour later with a piece of flat pine board and a wood-burning tool. He sat at the kitchen table while breakfast was being made and worked at it with quiet concentration, and when he was done, he set it on the table for everyone to see. It read, "Every stranger deserves a fair chance." He'd burned the letters evenly and cleanly, with the care of someone who had been thinking about the words for a while. May read it aloud, sounding out the longer words. Owen looked at it and nodded. Clara looked at it and then at Vivian, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did when she felt something strongly and was managing it. Thomas said, "Where are you putting it?" "Gate post," Caleb said. "Front entrance." Thomas nodded once, decided. Vivian looked at the sign, at the words burned clean into the wood. She thought about the train platform in March of the previous year, the cold, the single suitcase, the particular quality of uncertainty she'd carried off that train. Not fear exactly, but the state adjacent to it, the state of a person who has no margin left and is approaching a moment that will determine whether there's any margin to come. She thought about Caleb raising his hand on the platform, the simplest possible gesture, the recognition that she was the person he'd been waiting for, regardless of what she looked like or what she was carrying. She thought about what it means, what it actually means in the specific weight of real life, to give someone a fair chance, not a charitable chance, not a pitying chance, a fair one, the kind that assumes capacity rather than cataloging deficiency, the kind that lets a person bring what they have without apologizing for what they don't. She had been given that. She knew it. She held on to the knowing carefully, the way you hold on to things that are true and cost something and are therefore worth protecting. "It's a good sign," she said. Caleb looked at her. "I thought so." He hung it on the gatepost that afternoon, and it was there from then on. Visible from the road, readable from a distance, the first thing anyone saw when they came up the long drive to the Mercer Ranch. Weathered a little by summer, straightened a little by winter, but fixed. Staying. The federal investigation concluded the following spring. The Denver and Western Railroad was required to resurvey and refile 4 property claims in the region, 2 of which resulted in returned land to the families whose boundaries had been encroached upon. Gerald Foss was found to have altered county benchmark records in coordination with the railroad's surveying department and faced a federal censure that ended his career in land administration. Philip Corwin and his Missouri Pacific accusation were reviewed as part of the broader records examination, and the closed investigation file was formally noted as containing no finding, a quiet bureaucratic confirmation of what the county court letter had already said, but permanent now, part of the federal record. Pettiford wrote to tell Vivian about the investigation's conclusion. He added, at the end of his letter, that 2 of the ranching families whose land had been restored had asked him to pass along their thanks to the Mercers, and to Mrs. Mercer specifically. He said he was passing this along because he thought she should know, and because he had been wrong in his initial assessment of the situation and of her, and he wanted her to know that too. She wrote back and thanked him for the information and said she was glad it had resolved well and that she hoped he had a good spring. She meant it. She had not always been good at meaning such things. In the years before Broken Creek, when ordinary social warmth had been a performance she maintained to get through the day. But she meant it now, the way she meant most things she said now. Straightforwardly, without much cushioning, the way a person talks when they've decided that the world is, on balance, worth engaging with honestly. Thomas became a licensed federal deputy surveyor 9 years later. He worked the territory for 30 years, and his reputation was exactly what Vivian had hoped it would be: precise, reliable, incorruptible. He had a particular specialty in contested boundary cases, the kind where someone had filed a fraudulent claim and needed a surveyor patient and rigorous enough to find where the numbers had been moved. He was good at it. He'd been trained to be. Owen studied engineering. He left for the East at 18 and came back at 26 with a degree and a wife and the same quality of focused attention he'd had at 8, redistributed now across the practical problems of irrigation and land management. He and Thomas collaborated several times over the years on cases that required both surveying precision and engineering knowledge. And these collaborations were productive in the way that the work of siblings who genuinely respect each other's competence tends to be. Clara ran the ranch. She married a man from 2 counties over who was steady and patient and had the sense to recognize that he'd married a woman more capable than himself and to be grateful for it rather than threatened. She raised 4 children of her own on the Mercer property, in the house she'd managed since she was 9 years old, and she was the one who maintained the gate sign when the wood weathered past fixing and had a new one made, with the same words, because some things are worth repeating. May became a schoolteacher. This surprised no one who had known her as a child. The same relentless explaining, the same absolute conviction that information was interesting and should be shared, redirected into a classroom and pointed at 30 years of children who learned to read and cipher under the assumption that knowing things mattered. She taught in Broken Creek for a decade and then in 3 other towns as her husband's work moved them, and she carried the same conviction to every classroom, that a child who is taken seriously will take things seriously in return. Caleb lived to see all of this. He was not a demonstrative man, and he did not become one. But he was, over the years, something better than demonstrative. He was present in the specific way that people are present when they've decided that the life in front of them is the life worth paying attention to. He worked the ranch and knew the land and grew old the way men grow old when they've spent their years in hard weather, which is to say, he grew old honestly, with the evidence of the work in his hands and his face. He and Vivian grew old together in the way that people grow old together when they've built something instead of merely inhabiting it. Not without difficulty. Not without the ordinary frictions of 2 strong-willed people in close quarters over decades. But with the foundation that had been established early, honesty, the specific kind that cost something, and that foundation held. She outlived him by 4 years. She spent those 4 years at the ranch, with Clara nearby and the grandchildren underfoot, and she was not, in those years, the woman who had arrived with one suitcase and no margin. She was the woman who had stayed. When she went, she left the notebooks to Thomas. Or rather, the Federal Archive returned the originals to her estate following the completion of the investigation's permanent records, and she had left them to Thomas in her will with a note that said, "These are what accurate work looks like. Keep the standard." He kept them in his office for the rest of his career. Here is what is true, and what the Mercer family knew in their bones even when they couldn't have articulated it. The things that save us are rarely the things we plan to bring. They're the things we carried without knowing why, the habit we couldn't break, the skill we learned in a life we'd left behind. The notebook we almost didn't pack at 2 in the morning because we were tired and frightened and couldn't see yet what it was going to matter for. Vivian Hale had arrived in Broken Creek with nothing that anyone could see. She had arrived with everything that mattered. The sign on the gate post stayed, "Every stranger deserves a fair chance." It did not say, "Every stranger will prove themselves exceptional," or "Every stranger will save your ranch," or "Every stranger carries a hidden gift that will rescue everything." It said something simpler and harder than that. It said, "Begin with fairness. Begin with the assumption that what a person carries is worth something, even before you know what it is, especially before you know. Because the truth is that most people, given a fair chance, will show you something you didn't expect. And sometimes what they show you will change everything.